My name is Marion, and I just turned 70 years old last week. People always ask me why I'm still working 18-hour days at my little restaurant when I should be relaxing, enjoying retirement like other women my age. The truth is, I love what I do. I've been running Henderson's Family Diner for 25 years, ever since my husband passed away, and left me with nothing but determination and a small insurance policy. But on my 70th birthday, I discovered something that would change everything I thought I knew about family loyalty and the people I trusted most. Before I share what happened on that day that shook me to my core, let me know where you're watching from in the comments below. And don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe for more real-life stories about family betrayal and finding strength when you least expect it. Let me paint you a picture of my life before everything fell apart. Every morning at 4 a.m., my alarm clock would pierce through the darkness of my small bedroom. While most people my age were sound asleep, I'd already be pulling on my work clothes and heading to Henderson's Family Diner. The restaurant sits on the corner of Main Street and Fifth Avenue, a modest little place with red vinyl booths and checkered linoleum floors that have seen better days. But it's mine, every square inch of it, bought and paid for with my own sweat and tears. My daily routine never varied. I'd unlock the front door, flip on the lights, and start the coffee brewing before beginning the morning prep work. Fresh bread needed to be baked. Soup stocks had to be prepared, and the grill required a thorough cleaning from the night before. By 6 a.m., I'd have the front door open for the early morning crowd. Construction workers grabbing coffee and donuts before heading to job sites. Nurses finishing their night shifts at the hospital, and retired folks who'd made Henderson's their second home over the years. The work was demanding, but I thrived on it. From that 6 a.m. opening until 10 p.m. closing time, I was constantly moving. Taking orders, cooking meals, washing dishes, managing suppliers, balancing books. Most days I barely had time to sit down for 5 minutes, let alone take a proper lunch break. But seeing the satisfied faces of customers who'd been coming to my diner for decades made every aching muscle worth it. What made my situation more complicated was my living arrangement. After my husband died, I'd purchased a modest 3-bedroom house just 2 miles from the restaurant. When my daughter Sarah married David 7 years ago, they were struggling financially. David had just started his construction management job, and Sarah was working part-time as a receptionist at a dental office. I offered them the spare bedrooms, thinking it would be temporary just until they got on their feet. 7 years later, they were still there. Not that I minded Sarah's company, she was my only child, and I cherished having her nearby. But David, well, David was a different story entirely. At 47, he was a big man with calloused hands and an opinion about everything. In the beginning, he'd been respectful enough, even helpful around the house. He'd fix leaky faucets, mow the lawn, and occasionally help me move heavy equipment at the restaurant. But over the past 2 years, something had shifted in David's attitude toward me. He'd become increasingly impatient with my work schedule, making comments about how I was too old to be running around like a 20-year-old. When I'd come home exhausted after a particularly busy day, he'd shake his head and mutter things like, "This is ridiculous," or "Someone your age shouldn't be working this hard." Sarah would always defend me, bless her heart, reminding David that the restaurant was my life's work and primary source of income. What she didn't know, what I'd never told her, was that the profits from Henderson's Family Diner weren't just supporting me. Over the years, I'd quietly helped David and Sarah with car payments, medical bills, and even David's tools when he was starting out in construction management. The restaurant income had been supporting all 3 of us, though David seemed to have conveniently forgotten that fact. I'd also noticed David asking odd questions lately. Questions about property values in our neighborhood, about how restaurant businesses were valued, about retirement planning. At the time, I'd assumed he was just making conversation, maybe even showing concern for my future. I had no idea he was actually planning it. My 70th birthday fell on a Tuesday, which meant it was just another workday at Henderson's. I'd gotten up at 4 a.m. as usual, though I'll admit I'd hoped someone might remember what day it was. The house was quiet when I left Sarah and David still sleeping soundly in their bedroom down the hall. I'd left a note on the kitchen counter about being at the restaurant early, same as always. The morning prep work felt heavier than usual. Maybe it was the weight of the milestone birthday, or maybe I was finally feeling my age. I kneaded bread dough with hands that were definitely more arthritic than they'd been at 60, and my lower back protested as I bent to pull fresh muffins from the oven. But muscle memory took over, and soon I was lost in the familiar rhythm of preparing for another day. The first customers started trickling in at 6 a.m. sharp. Jerry, a retired postal worker who'd been coming in for 12 years, ordered his usual coffee and blueberry muffin. Mrs. Patterson, a widow who lived alone in the apartment complex across the street, settled into her regular booth with a newspaper and ordered scrambled eggs with wheat toast. These were my people, the regulars who made Henderson's feel like a community center rather than just a business. Around 8 a.m., Jerry looked up from his crossword puzzle and said, "Marion, isn't today your birthday? I could swear Sarah mentioned it last week." The fact that one of my customers remembered when my own family hadn't even acknowledged it hit me harder than I'd expected. I smiled and confirmed it was indeed my 70th, and Jerry immediately called out to the other customers, "Everyone, it's Marion's birthday today." What followed was completely unexpected and deeply touching. Mrs. Patterson started singing Happy Birthday, and soon the entire diner joined in. Someone produced a small candle and stuck it in a fresh cinnamon roll. Another customer ran next door to the flower shop and came back with a small bouquet. By 9 a.m., I had birthday cards written on napkins' phone numbers for the best retirement planners in town, and more hugs than I'd received in months. The kindness of these virtual strangers filled a hollow place in my chest I hadn't even realized was empty. Here were people who saw me every day, who knew my coffee was always fresh, and my eggs were always cooked perfectly, treating me with more consideration than my own family had shown. Around noon, Sarah called the restaurant. "Happy birthday, Mom," she said, though her voice sounded distracted. "I'm sorry we didn't have time this morning. David had an early meeting, and I was running late for work. Maybe we can do something this weekend." I told her not to worry about it, that I understood everyone was busy, but deep down it stung. This wasn't just any birthday, it was my 70th. I'd been hoping for something more than a rushed phone call and a vague promise of maybe this weekend. The afternoon lunch rush was brutal. Construction crews from 3 different job sites decided to descend on Henderson's at the same time, and I found myself scrambling to keep up with orders. I was running between the kitchen and the dining room, taking orders, cooking burgers, refilling coffee cups, and cleaning tables in what felt like an endless cycle. My feet were screaming inside my work shoes, and sweat was beading on my forehead, despite the November chill outside. By 6 p.m., I should have been thinking about closing prep and heading home. But Tuesdays were always unpredictable, and the dinner crowd was just getting started. A young family with 3 small children occupied the corner booth, while 2 elderly couples shared stories over coffee and pie. Part of me wanted to flip the sign to "closed" and call it a day, but another part of me, the part that had kept Henderson's successful for 25 years, wouldn't let me disappoint customers. As the clock approached 8 p.m., I was finally able to start the closing routine. Wiping down tables, cleaning the grill, counting the day's receipts, and preparing the morning coffee setup. My reflection in the front window showed a tired woman with grey hair escaping from its ponytail and flour stains on her apron. 70 years old and still working, like I was half that age. The drive home was quiet, giving me too much time to think about the day. Part of me felt proud that I could still put in a full day's work, still provide a service that people in my community valued. But another part felt forgotten, like the people who should have cared the most had simply overlooked one of life's major milestones. When I pulled into the driveway at 8:15 p.m., I could see the warm glow of lights in the living room windows. For a brief moment, I allowed myself to hope that maybe Sarah and David had planned something after all. Maybe they'd just been keeping it a surprise. I gathered my purse and the small bouquet that Mrs. Patterson had insisted I take home, fishing for my house keys as I approached the front door. But as I reached for the door handle, I could hear voices coming from inside. Sarah and David were having a conversation in the living room, their voices carrying through the thin walls of the old house. I paused with my key halfway to the lock. Something about the tone of their conversation made me hesitate. They weren't talking loudly, but there was an intensity to their voices that made me curious. Instead of immediately announcing my arrival, I quietly turned the key and stepped into the front hallway. "David, she worked 18 hours today on her birthday," Sarah was saying, and I could hear the concern in her voice. "She looked exhausted when she left this morning, and she'll probably be exhausted when she gets home." "That's exactly my point," David responded, and his tone was sharper than I'd ever heard him use with Sarah before. "Your mother is 70 years old now. She shouldn't be working like this anymore. It's not normal for someone her age to be putting in 18-hour days running a restaurant." I found myself frozen in the hallway, still holding my purse and the wilted flowers. Part of me knew I should make my presence known, should walk into the living room and join their conversation. But something about David's tone kept me rooted in place. "She loves that restaurant," Sarah replied, and I could picture her sitting on our old couch, probably still in her work clothes from the dental office. "It's been her life for 25 years. She built it from nothing after Dad died." "And that's admirable," David said, though his voice carried no admiration whatsoever. "But it's becoming a burden, Sarah. We need to start thinking practically about this situation. She can't keep living like this, and we can't keep enabling it." My heart started beating faster, enabling it. What was he talking about? "What do you mean, enabling it?" Sarah asked, echoing my own thoughts. David's next words hit me like a physical blow. "I mean, we need to start having serious conversations about a nursing home. Your mother is 70 years old, working herself to death, and for what? That restaurant is worth good money, but she's running it into the ground with her stubbornness." I had to grip the hallway wall to steady myself. A nursing home David was talking about, putting me in a nursing home. "David, that's ridiculous," Sarah said, but her voice sounded less certain than before. "Mom is perfectly capable of taking care of herself. She's in better shape than most people half her age." "Is she, though?" David pressed. "When's the last time she took a vacation? When's the last time she saw a doctor for a real checkup? She's working 18 hours a day, 7 days a week. That's not sustainable, and it's not healthy." There was a pause, and I could imagine Sarah considering his words. My daughter had always been trusting, always willing to see the best in people. It was one of her most beautiful qualities, but also one that made her vulnerable to manipulation. "I just think," David continued his voice, taking on what I now recognized as a calculated tone, "that we need to start making some hard decisions before something happens. Before she has a heart attack at that restaurant, or falls and breaks a hip. We need to be proactive here." "But a nursing home, David. That seems extreme." "Not a nursing home," David corrected quickly. "A nice assisted living facility. Somewhere she can have her own apartment, but also have help when she needs it. And think about it, Sarah. If we sold the restaurant property, we could afford a really nice place for her. That corner lot is worth at least $400,000 in today's market." My blood turned to ice. David had researched property values. He'd been planning this. "We could use that money to make sure she has the best care possible," David continued. "And honestly, it would take a huge financial burden off our shoulders too. We've been living here for 7 years, Sarah. Don't you want our own place? Don't you want to start thinking about our future instead of just maintaining her past?" I realized I was holding my breath, waiting for Sarah's response. My daughter, the child I'd raised alone after her father died, the girl I'd worked 18-hour days to put through college. I don't know, Sarah said finally. It just feels wrong to be planning her future without her input. And she seems happy with her life the way it is. Happy, David laughed, and there was no humor in it. Sarah, your mother is 70 years old and working like a slave in that restaurant. She has no social life, no hobbies, no retirement savings that we know of. That's not happiness. That's just stubbornness and fear of change. Maybe you're right, Sarah said quietly, and those 4 words shattered something inside my chest. I know I'm right, David said with confidence. Look, I'll start researching some facilities, nice places, not warehouses. And maybe I'll call that real estate agent who left his card at the restaurant last month, just to get an idea of what the property is worth. We don't have to do anything right away, but we should start planning. I heard footsteps approaching the hallway, and I quickly slipped out the front door, closing it as quietly as possible. My hands were shaking as I stood on my own front porch, trying to process what I'd just heard. David wasn't just suggesting a nursing home out of concern for my health. He'd been planning this, researching property values, thinking about the money. And my daughter, my sweet, trusting daughter, was starting to believe him. I drove around the neighborhood for 20 minutes before returning home, giving myself time to compose my face and figure out how to act normal. When I finally walked through the front door for the second time that evening, Sarah and David were watching television as if nothing had happened. "Happy birthday, Mom," Sarah said, getting up to give me a hug. "How was your day?" I managed to smile and tell her it was fine, busy, but good. David glanced up from the TV and nodded in my direction. "Long day," he commented. "You look tired." Those 2 words, "you look tired," felt loaded with new meaning after what I'd overheard. Was he already building his case, already documenting evidence of my supposed decline? I excused myself early, claiming exhaustion, and retreated to my bedroom. But sleep was impossible. I lay in my bed staring at the ceiling and listening to the familiar sounds of the house settling around me. The house I'd bought with my own money. The house I'd welcomed Sarah and David into out of love and generosity. My mind kept returning to David's words about the restaurant property being worth $400,000. Had he been researching this behind my back? When had he contacted a real estate agent? How long had he been planning to get rid of me? I thought about the years since David had moved in. All the times I'd helped with their expenses, all the financial support I'd provided without being asked for repayment, the tools I'd bought for his work truck, the medical bills I'd helped cover when Sarah had her appendectomy, the car repair bills I'd paid when their old Honda finally died. But it wasn't just the money that hurt. It was the realization that David had been watching me, evaluating me, deciding that my life had less value than his convenience. In his mind, I wasn't a person with my own dreams and desires. I was an obstacle to his plans, a problem to be solved. As the hours passed, I found myself thinking about my late husband, Tom. He'd been a good man, honest and hard-working, who'd treated people with respect regardless of their age or circumstances. What would he think of David's plan to ship me off to an assisted living facility so they could sell my life's work? I also thought about my customers at Henderson's. Jerry, who shared his crossword puzzles with me every morning. Mrs. Patterson, who'd started bringing her late husband's favorite book to read aloud during her daily coffee break because she missed having someone to share stories with. The construction workers who trusted me to fuel them for hard days of physical labor. These people saw value in what I did, saw worth in my contribution to their daily lives. But apparently, my own son-in-law saw me as nothing more than a stubborn old woman, standing between him and a $400,000 payday. By 3 a.m., I'd made a decision. I wasn't going to confront David immediately, wasn't going to create drama, or force Sarah to choose sides. Instead, I was going to be smart about this. I was going to gather information. understand exactly what David had been planning, and then decide how to protect myself and my future. The first step would be visiting my attorney, Robert Chen, who'd handled the legal work when I'd purchased the restaurant and the house. I needed to understand exactly what legal protections I had, what David could and couldn't do, and what options were available to me. The second step would be finding out exactly how far David's planning had progressed. If he'd been researching nursing homes and real estate values, there would be evidence of that research. Phone calls, internet searches, maybe even written estimates or brochures. And the third step, well, that would depend on what the first two steps revealed. But I was beginning to formulate a plan that would ensure David's schemes backfired spectacularly. As dawn approached, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. A sense of righteous anger that was actually energizing rather than draining. David thought he could manipulate an old woman, thought he could take advantage of my generosity and my love for my daughter. He was about to learn just how wrong he was. The next morning, I called in sick to Henderson's for the first time in 3 years. I left Sarah a note saying I had errands to run, then drove straight to Robert Chen's law office downtown. Robert had been handling my legal affairs for over a decade, and I trusted him completely. "Marion," Robert said, rising from behind his massive oak desk as his secretary showed me in. "This is a pleasant surprise. What can I do for you today?" I'd prepared what to say during the drive over. "Robert, I need to review all my legal documents. The restaurant, the house, my will, everything. And I need to understand what protections I have if someone tries to declare me incompetent or force me into assisted living." Robert's eyebrows rose slightly, but he was too professional to ask probing questions. Instead, he pulled out my files and spent the next hour walking me through every document. The restaurant and property were in my name alone. The house was also solely in my name. My will currently left everything to Sarah with David as an alternate beneficiary if something happened to her. "The good news," Robert explained, "is that as long as you're mentally competent, no one can force you into assisted living or take control of your property without your consent. The bad news is that if someone wanted to challenge your competency, they could file for guardianship proceedings." How would that work? They'd need to provide evidence that you're unable to make sound decisions about your health, safety, or finances. Usually that requires medical documentation, evidence of cognitive decline, that sort of thing. But it's a high bar to clear, especially for someone like you who's clearly running a successful business. I felt somewhat relieved, but I pressed further. What if someone had been documenting my behavior, trying to build a case that I'm working too hard or making poor decisions? Robert studied my face carefully. "Marion, is there something specific you're worried about? Has someone threatened you or suggested you're incompetent?" I decided to be partially honest. "My son-in-law has been making comments about my age and work schedule. I want to make sure I'm protected." "I see." Robert made some notes on his legal pad. "Well, the fact that you're here today asking these questions and thinking ahead is pretty strong evidence of your mental competency. But if you're concerned, we could arrange for a formal competency evaluation. Having that documentation could be useful if anyone ever challenges you legally." We scheduled the competency evaluation for the following week, and Robert also suggested updating my will to be more specific about my wishes regarding the restaurant and my living situation. If you want to ensure your business continues operating and that no one can force you into assisted living against your will, we can make those stipulations explicit in your legal documents. After leaving Robert's office, I drove to the public library and used their computers to do some research of my own. I created a free email account under a fake name and started searching for information about nursing homes and assisted living facilities in our area. What I found was disturbing. David hadn't just been talking theoretically about assisted living. I discovered that someone using our home computer had been visiting websites for 3 specific facilities over the past month. The search history showed detailed research into costs, amenities, and admission requirements. Even more damning, I found evidence that someone had requested information packets from these facilities. The dates on the searches corresponded with days when I'd been working late at the restaurant, and David would have had unsupervised access to our home computer. But the most shocking discovery came when I searched for real estate activity in our neighborhood. A property 3 blocks away, similar to mine, had recently sold for $425,000. The listing agent was Marcus Webb, the same name I'd seen on a business card left at Henderson's the previous month. David hadn't just been casually researching property values. He'd been getting specific information about what my restaurant property was worth, probably positioning himself as the future seller. That evening, I returned home with a clearer picture of what I was dealing with. David had been systematically planning my removal from my own life, researching every angle from nursing home costs to property values. He'd been building a case for why I needed help, while simultaneously calculating how much money he stood to gain from my displacement. During dinner, I watched David more carefully than I ever had before. He was pleasant enough asking about my day and commenting on the weather, but there was something calculating in the way he observed me noting when I rubbed my arthritic hands or stretched my sore back. "You seem tired lately, Marion," he commented as I cleared the dishes. "Maybe you should consider hiring some help at the restaurant, someone younger who could handle the heavy lifting." Sarah nodded in agreement. "Mom, David has a point. You don't have to do everything yourself anymore." I smiled and thanked them for their concern, but inside I was furious. David was still building his case, still documenting what he saw as evidence of my decline. Every suggestion about help or taking it easy was actually a step in his plan to prove I was no longer capable of independent living. That night I called my neighbor, Mrs. Rodriguez, who lived next door, and had a clear view of our driveway and front yard. We'd been friendly for years, sharing garden vegetables and keeping an eye on each other's properties. "Eleanor," I said, "I need to ask you a favor, and it might sound strange, but have you noticed any unusual activity at my house lately? People coming and going when I'm not there?" Elena was quiet for a moment. "Actually, Marion, yes. Last week there was a man in a suit who came to your door when you weren't home. David talked to him on the front porch for about 20 minutes. I thought maybe he was selling something, but they seemed to know each other." My suspicions were confirmed. David had been meeting with people behind my back, probably the real estate agent, or possibly someone from the assisted living facilities. "And there was something else," Elena continued. "A few days ago, I saw David taking pictures of your house with his phone. Front yard, backyard, even the inside through the windows. I thought it was odd." Pictures of my property. David was documenting everything, building a complete file for his plans. I thanked Elena and asked her to keep an eye on things, telling her I was concerned about security. She readily agreed, not knowing she was actually helping me gather evidence against my own son-in-law. As I prepared for bed that night, I realized I had enough information to confront David directly. But confrontation wasn't my goal. I wanted justice, and I wanted to make sure his schemes backfired completely. That meant I needed to be smarter than him, more strategic, and more patient. David thought he was dealing with a naive old woman who would be easily manipulated or pushed aside. Instead, he was about to discover that 70 years of life had taught me a few things about strategy, patience, and the importance of fighting for what's rightfully yours. Over the next 2 weeks, I implemented my plan with the precision I'd learned from running a successful restaurant for 25 years. First, I arranged for a formal competency evaluation with a geriatric specialist recommended by Robert Chen. The evaluation included cognitive testing, medical examination, and interviews about my daily functioning. Dr. Sarah Martinez, the specialist, concluded that I was in excellent mental and physical health for my age. Her report noted my sharp cognitive abilities, excellent memory, and high level of independent functioning. She specifically commented that my ability to successfully manage a complex business operation was evidence of continued competency and sound decision-making skills. With that documentation secured, Robert and I updated my will and created additional legal protections. The new documents included specific language about my wishes to continue working and living independently for as long as I was competent. More importantly, we added a codicil that would immediately revoke all inheritance rights for anyone who attempted to have me declared incompetent or force me into assisted living against my will. But the most crucial element of my plan involved setting a trap for David. I needed him to reveal his intentions in a way that would be undeniable, preferably in front of witnesses who could testify to his motives. The opportunity came when Sarah mentioned that her sister Jennifer was coming to visit from California the following weekend. Jennifer and I had always been close, and she'd been like a second daughter to me over the years. She was also a successful attorney who would immediately recognize what David was trying to do. I suggested we have a family dinner to celebrate Jennifer's visit, inviting not just her, but also my brother Frank and his wife Mary, who lived about an hour away. It would be a perfect family gathering and perfect witnesses for what I had planned. During the week leading up to the dinner, I began dropping subtle hints about being tired about the restaurant, becoming more challenging to manage, about thinking it might be time to make some changes. I complained about my arthritis, mentioned feeling overwhelmed by the bookkeeping, and even suggested that maybe I was getting too old for 18-hour workdays. David took the bait immediately. I could see the excitement in his eyes as he heard what he interpreted as confirmation of his assessment. He became more attentive, more solicitous, asking detailed questions about my finances and future plans. "You know, Marion," he said one evening, "if you're really thinking about making changes, Sarah and I would be happy to help. We could look into some options for you, maybe visit some facilities, get information about what's available." I thanked him for his concern and told him I'd appreciate any help they could provide. Inside, I was disgusted by his eagerness to begin dismantling my life. But I maintained my facade of a tired old woman who was finally ready to give up. The night before the family dinner, I made one final preparation. I borrowed a small recording device from Mrs. Rodriguez, whose late husband had been a private investigator. The device was tiny, easily concealed, and could record several hours of clear audio. I also prepared a folder containing all the evidence I'd gathered printouts of the internet searches from our home computer copies of the information requests to assisted living facilities. Documentation of David's meetings with the real estate agent, and photos of him photographing my property. Everything was organized chronologically, showing a clear pattern of planning and deception. Saturday evening arrived with unseasonably warm November weather, perfect for the family gathering I'd orchestrated. Jennifer arrived first, looking radiant and successful in her tailored business attire. She hugged me tightly and commented on how well I looked, how energetic I seemed. Frank and Mary arrived shortly after, followed by Jennifer's husband Paul, who'd driven up from the city. As we all settled in the living room with drinks and appetizers, the conversation naturally turned to how everyone was doing career updates and family news. I waited until after dinner, when everyone was relaxed and comfortable, to begin the final phase of my plan. The recording device was running in my cardigan pocket, and I had my evidence folder ready in the kitchen. I'm so glad everyone could be here tonight. I began settling into my favorite armchair with a cup of coffee. Actually, there's something I've been wanting to discuss with all of you. I've been doing a lot of thinking lately about my future, about the restaurant, about my living situation. I could see David straightening up in his chair, suddenly very attentive. Sarah looked concerned, probably wondering where this conversation was heading. "I'm 70 years old," I continued, "and I'll be honest with you all. The restaurant is becoming more challenging to manage. I'm tired in ways I never used to be, and I'm starting to think it might be time to consider some changes." Jennifer frowned. "Aunt Marion, you seem as sharp and energetic as ever. Are you feeling unwell?" No, no, I said, waving my hand dismissively. I'm healthy, thank God, but David has been helping me think through some practical considerations about aging and planning for the future. This was David's cue, and he didn't disappoint. He leaned forward with an expression of concern that looked genuine to anyone who didn't know what I knew. Marion has been working incredibly hard for decades, David said, addressing the room like he was the concerned family member looking out for my best interests. 18-hour days, 7 days a week at her age. I've been trying to help her think about more sustainable options. What kind of options? Frank asked. Well, David said, warming to his subject. There are some excellent assisted living communities in the area. Places where Marion could have her own apartment, but also have support services available. She wouldn't have to worry about cooking or cleaning or maintaining a house. And what about the restaurant? Jennifer asked. This was the moment I'd been waiting for. David's eyes practically lit up as he prepared to reveal his real motivations. That's actually the beautiful part of this plan, David said, his voice taking on the enthusiasm of someone who'd thought through every detail. The restaurant property is sitting on some very valuable real estate. That corner lot is worth at least $400,000 in today's market. If we sold it, we could afford to put Marion in a really nice facility, probably the best in the state. The room went quiet. I could see Jennifer and Frank exchanging glances, and I knew they were starting to understand what this was really about. Jennifer asked her attorney, instincts clearly activated. Who exactly is we in this scenario? David didn't seem to notice the edge in her voice. Well, Sarah and I, of course. We'd handle all the arrangements, manage the sale, make sure Marion gets the best possible care. And what happens to the proceeds from the sale? Frank asked. After paying for Marion's care, any remaining funds would be held in trust, David said smoothly. Sarah is Marion's heir, so eventually it would become part of her inheritance. But the important thing is making sure Marion has everything she needs. I could see the calculation in David's expression, the assumption that he was talking to people who would see the financial logic of his plan. He had no idea he'd just confessed his real motivations in front of several witnesses, including an attorney who specialized in elder law. That's very thoughtful of you, David, I said calmly. Tell me, how long have you been researching these assisted living facilities? David shifted slightly in his chair. Oh, just recently, since you started mentioning being tired. I see. And the real estate research. When did you start looking into property values? Now. David looked uncomfortable. I just wanted to have information available in case you decided to consider your options. I stood up and walked to the kitchen, returning with my evidence folder. The room was absolutely silent as I opened it and began pulling out documents. This is interesting, I said, holding up a printout. Because according to the internet history on our home computer, someone has been researching assisted living facilities for over a month. Long before I mentioned being tired. David's face went pale. And this, I continued pulling out another document, shows contact with Marcus Webb, a real estate agent dating back 6 weeks, including a meeting at our house when I wasn't home. Jennifer stood up and moved closer to examine the documents. As an attorney, she immediately understood what she was looking at. David, I said, my voice growing stronger with each word. Would you like to explain why you've been photographing my property, or why you've requested information packets from 3 different assisted living facilities, or why you've been telling people I'm incompetent and need to be placed in care? The room erupted. Sarah gasped and stared at her husband in shock. Frank demanded to know what was going on. Jennifer was rapidly flipping through the evidence, her expression growing more serious by the moment. But I wasn't finished. You see, everyone, I said, addressing the room, while keeping my eyes on David. What David didn't know is that I heard his conversation with Sarah last week. The conversation where he said I should be in a nursing home so you could sell my restaurant and use the money for your own purposes. Sarah stood up abruptly. "David, is this true?" David started to stammer a denial, but I held up my hand. "Actually, don't bother lying," I said, "because I have it all recorded." The aftermath was swift and decisive. Jennifer, in her capacity as an attorney, immediately recognized that David's actions constituted potential elder abuse and financial exploitation. She advised me to file a police report and consider pursuing criminal charges. Sarah was devastated. The woman I'd raised to see the best in people had been completely blindsided by her husband's deception and greed. She spent the rest of the evening apologizing through tears, horrified that she'd even momentarily considered his suggestions about assisted living. Frank and Mary were outraged on my behalf, offering to testify to anything they'd witnessed and providing whatever support I needed. The family I'd worried might judge me for being too old to work was instead rallying around me against someone who'd tried to exploit me. David, faced with irrefutable evidence of his scheming, tried various approaches to save himself. First denial, then minimization. I was just trying to help, then promises that he'd never intended to hurt me. But the evidence was overwhelming, and everyone in that room could see his true character clearly. Within 2 weeks, Sarah had filed for divorce. She couldn't reconcile her image of the man she'd married with the reality of someone who would coldly plan to institutionalize an elderly family member for financial gain. The fact that he'd been willing to manipulate her into supporting his scheme made the betrayal even worse. The legal proceedings moved quickly. Robert Chen filed restraining orders, preventing David from accessing any of my property or financial information. We also filed criminal complaints for attempted financial exploitation of an elderly person, which carried serious felony charges in our state. David was forced to move out of my house immediately. Without Sarah's income and the free housing I'd been providing, he struggled financially. The construction company where he worked learned about the criminal charges and terminated his employment, citing concerns about character and trustworthiness. But the most satisfying consequence was completely unexpected. Word of David's scheme spread through our small community, and his reputation was destroyed. In a town where many residents were elderly and living independently, attempting to defraud a 70-year-old business owner was seen as particularly reprehensible. David found himself unable to get work in construction anywhere in the region. His professional references dried up, his network of contacts distanced themselves from him, and he eventually had to leave town entirely to find employment. Sarah and I grew closer through the ordeal. She moved out of the house we'd shared, wanting to start fresh, but she also started helping me at the restaurant part-time. Having her there allowed me to reduce my workload to a more reasonable 12 hours a day, and I discovered I enjoyed teaching her the business I'd built from nothing. 6 months later, Sarah met someone new, a kind, honest man named Thomas, who worked as a teacher at the local elementary school. When I met Thomas, I immediately liked his genuine interest in my work and his respect for my independence. He asked thoughtful questions about the restaurant, complimented my business acumen, and never once suggested I was too old for anything. The restaurant thrived more than ever. Word of my story had spread throughout the community, and I found myself with more customers than I could handle. People came not just for the good food, but to support a local business owner who'd stood up for herself and won. I also discovered that my story had inspired other elderly people in similar situations. I received letters and phone calls from seniors across the state who were dealing with family members trying to take advantage of them. I started volunteering with a local organization that provided legal resources and support for elderly people facing financial exploitation. Looking back on that difficult period, I realized that David had actually done me a favor. His scheme forced me to examine my legal protections, strengthen my documentation, and build a network of support I hadn't known I needed. It also showed me that at 70 I was still capable of fighting for myself and winning. At 70, I learned that age doesn't make you helpless, it makes you wise. Sometimes the people closest to you see your kindness as weakness, but there's a difference between being generous and being taken advantage of. I'd spent years helping David and Sarah financially, supporting them through difficult times, providing them with a stable home. But David had interpreted my generosity as vulnerability, my trust as naivety. The experience taught me that true family doesn't try to control your choices or profit from your situation. True family supports your independence and respects your right to make decisions about your own life. Sarah had proven herself to be true family by standing with me once she understood what was happening. David had proven himself to be a predator who saw elderly people as opportunities rather than human beings deserving of respect. I'm still here, still cooking, still serving my community. I'm still working, though, at a more sustainable pace, with Sarah's help. And I've never been happier to prove someone wrong about what a 70-year-old woman can do. Have you ever had someone in your family try to take advantage of your kindness? How did you handle it? Share your story in the comments below, and don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more real-life stories about standing up for yourself, no matter what your age. Share this with anyone who might be facing similar challenges, because sometimes we all need to be reminded that we're stronger than the people who try to diminish us. Thank you for listening to my story, and remember that it's never too late to fight for the life you've built and the independence you've earned.